The morning Corporal James Franklin Henley disappeared into the Apennine foothills. The sky over southern Italy hung low and grey, pressing down like a lid on a pot about to boil over. It was late November 1943, 3 weeks after the Allied push toward Cassino had stalled in mud and German steel. Henley wasn't supposed to be there at all. He was supposed to be dead, or at minimum rotting in a prisoner of war camp somewhere north of Rome. Instead, he was alone, moving through scrub oak and limestone outcrops with a dislocated shoulder, 2 fractured ribs, and a Springfield rifle he'd taken off a dead Wehrmacht sergeant 2 days prior. The rifle had no scope. The stock was cracked. He had 11 rounds. He'd been a scout sniper with the 36th Infantry Division, attached to a reconnaissance patrol probing German positions near the village of San Pietro in Fine when mortar fire tore his squad apart. The blast had thrown him 15 feet into a drainage ditch, knocked him unconscious, and buried him under enough rubble and body parts that the enemy sweep had passed him by. When he woke, it was dark. His left arm wouldn't move right. His hearing in one ear was gone, replaced by a high whine that wouldn't quit. He'd crawled west for 2 nights, following the stars, avoiding roads, eating nothing but wild chestnuts and rainwater collected in his helmet. On the 3rd morning, he stumbled onto a burned-out farmhouse where he found the German's body, the rifle, and a leather pouch containing bread so stale it crumbled in his hands. He ate it anyway. Now he was moving again, because staying still meant dying. The Germans were everywhere in these hills, dug in along the Gustav Line, waiting for the Americans to break themselves against fortified ridges and minefields. Henley knew the odds. He knew that every step south brought him closer to Allied lines, but also deeper into contested ground, where neither side held clear control. He knew that if a patrol caught him, they'd shoot him as a saboteur or drag him north in chains. He also knew that somewhere behind him, in a ravine he'd passed at dawn, there were 3 more Americans. He'd heard them before he saw them. Low voices, American accents, the unmistakable cadence of men trying not to be heard. He'd frozen, gone flat in the brush, and watched through a gap in the stones as they picked their way along the ridgeline. 2 were walking wounded, limping badly. The 3rd carried a Thompson submachine gun and kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected the devil himself to come sprinting out of the trees. Henley hadn't called out. He'd stayed hidden, watched them pass, then continued alone. It wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. 3 men made noise. 3 men left tracks. 3 men drew fire. 1 man, if he was careful, if he was patient, might slip through. That's what he told himself anyway, as he worked his way down a goat trail toward a stone bridge he'd spotted from higher ground. The bridge crossed a narrow stream that fed into the Garigliano River Valley, where intelligence said the Fifth Army was consolidating for another push. If he could reach the river, if he could cross it, if he could avoid the German machine gun nests and the American artillery that sometimes dropped short, he might live long enough to report back. Might see a medic, might sleep without one eye open. But guilt doesn't follow orders. It doesn't care about tactical sense or survival odds. It sits in the back of your skull and whispers, and Henley heard it clearly now, louder than the ringing in his bad ear. He'd left 3 men behind. They were moving slow, exposed, heading the same direction he was. And somewhere between that ravine and the bridge, the math was going to catch up with them. He knew it the way a farmer knows rain is coming, the way a dog knows when something's wrong in the woods. Those men wouldn't make it, not without help, not without someone who knew how to shoot. If you want to know whether James Henley turned back, whether he found those men again, and what it cost him to do what came next, you'll need to follow this all the way to the end. Because what happened on that hillside, in the 48 hours that followed, was the kind of thing that doesn't make it into after-action reports, the kind of thing that gets told in whispers, if it gets told at all. Henley had been raised in a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, where Sunday mornings meant church and Sunday afternoons meant work. His father ran a lumber mill and believed in 2 things, the Bible and paying your debts. Henley had inherited both. He'd joined the army in 1941, Not out of patriotism exactly, but because staying home felt like dodging a bill that was coming due. The war was happening. Men were needed. Simple as that. He'd tested high on the rifle range at Fort Benning and been selected for sniper training, which mostly meant learning to sit still for hours, control his breathing, and squeeze a trigger without flinching. He was good at it. Better than good. By the time his unit shipped out to North Africa, he'd logged more confirmed kills than anyone else in his company, though he never talked about the number. Numbers made it feel like hunting, and hunting was something you did to animals. This was different. Italy had been different still. The terrain was brutal, the Germans were dug in deep, and every valley was a kill box. Henley had seen boys from his squad cut down by artillery, by snipers, by mines that blew their legs off and left them screaming in the dirt. He'd learned to shut that part of his mind off, to focus on the job, to take the shot when the shot was there. But lately, the shut-off valve wasn't working so well. He'd think about a German officer he'd dropped from 400 yards, the way the man's head had snapped back, and he'd feel nothing. Then he'd think about Private Kowalski, who'd bled out in his arms after stepping on a teller mine, and he'd feel everything at once. It didn't make sense. None of it did. And somewhere in the middle of that confusion was the question he couldn't answer. If God was watching, what did he think of a man who killed for a living, even if the cause was just? Now, crouched in the underbrush 50 yards from the stone bridge, Henley was asking that question again. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for a cart, with low stone walls on either side. The stream below was shallow, running fast over smooth rocks. On the far side, the trail climbed steeply into a stand of chestnut trees, and beyond that, the ridge where the Americans were supposedly digging in. But between here and there, the ground was open. Exposed. 100 yards of nothing but scrub and scattered boulders. If the Germans had an observation post on the high ground, they'd see anyone crossing that bridge. And if they had a machine gun crew set up in those trees, anyone on that bridge would be dead before they took 10 steps. Henley watched for 15 minutes, scanning the tree line, the rocks, the shadows. He saw nothing. Heard nothing but the stream and the wind. That didn't mean much. German snipers were patient. They'd wait all day for one shot. He'd done the same. The question was whether to risk it now, in daylight, or wait until dark and hope he didn't freeze to death first. His shoulder was throbbing, a deep ache that radiated down his arm and into his chest. His ribs hurt when he breathed. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the hunger had gone past the point of cramps into a hollow, distant feeling, like his body was consuming itself from the inside out. He was about to move when he heard voices. German voices, coming from the trail behind him, maybe 200 yards back. 3 men, maybe 4, talking in low tones, not shouting, not panicked, just moving through. A patrol. Henley's stomach dropped. He was caught between them and the bridge, no cover worth a damn, and if they swept down this trail, they'd walk right past him. He had maybe 2 minutes to decide. Cross the bridge now and hope the far side was clear, or stay hidden and hope the patrol passed without noticing the bent grass and boot prints he'd left in the soft earth. He looked at the bridge again. Then he looked at the Springfield in his hands. 11 rounds. The rifle was bolt action, slow, loud as hell. If he fired, every German in a mile would know exactly where he was. If he didn't fire, and they spotted him, he'd have to anyway. Either way, the odds were bad. Then he heard something else. A different sound, farther east, coming from the direction he'd been moving earlier. The unmistakable clatter of equipment, boots on stone, and a low voice cursing in English. The 3 Americans. They were coming down the same trail, heading straight toward the bridge, and they had no idea the Germans were closing in from behind. Henley closed his eyes, took a breath, felt the weight of the decision settle on him like a stone. He could stay hidden, let the patrol pass, let the Americans walk into whatever was waiting for them, save his own skin. Or he could do what his father would have done, what the God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore would expect, and make sure those men had a chance. He opened his eyes, checked the rifle. 11 rounds, one dislocated shoulder, no scope, 200 yards of open ground and a bridge he wasn't sure was safe to cross. He whispered a prayer he didn't believe would be answered, then started moving toward the voices. The first American he reached was a sergeant named Daly, a thick-shouldered man from Boston with a face like a brick wall and a bullet wound in his left thigh that had bled through the makeshift bandage wrapped around it. The second was a private, couldn't have been more than 20, skinny and pale, with one arm cradled against his chest and eyes that looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The third was the one with the Thompson, a corporal named Ritchie, who swung the muzzle toward Henley the second he stepped out of the brush. "Easy," Henley said, raising his good hand. "36th Infantry, Scout Sniper, Corporal Henley." Ritchie didn't lower the gun. "Prove it." Henley rattled off his serial number, his unit, and the name of his company commander. Ritchie stared at him for another 5 seconds, then finally dropped the muzzle. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "You alone?" "Was. You see any Krauts?" "Patrol, 200 yards back, coming this way." Daly cursed. The private just stared. "We gotta move," Ritchie said. "Now." "Not that way." Henley nodded toward the bridge. "Could be an OP on the ridge, could be a gun crew. We go across in daylight, we're sitting ducks." "So what do you suggest?" Daly's voice was tight, edged with pain. Henley looked at the three of them, looked at the bridge, looked back the way he'd come, where the German voices were getting closer. "How fast can you move?" Daly grimaced. "Not fast enough." "Then we hold here, let them pass. Circle back after dark and try the bridge then." "And if they don't pass?" the private asked, voice cracking. Henley met his eyes. "Then I make sure they do." Ritchie shook his head. "You can't take on a patrol by yourself. I don't have to take them on. I just have to slow them down. Give you time to get across. That's a suicide play." "Maybe." Henley shifted the rifle on his shoulder, felt the pain flare white-hot through his ribs. "But it's the only play we've got." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches overhead. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. Daly looked at Ritchie. Ritchie looked at the private. Then they all looked at Henley. "All right," Daly said finally. "But if you're staying, we're staying. We don't leave a man behind." Henley wanted to argue, wanted to tell them that staying was stupid, that they'd all die if they didn't move. But he saw the look in Daly's eyes, the set of Ritchie's jaw, and he knew there was no point. These were the kind of men who paid their debts, the kind who didn't run. "Fine," he said, "then we dig in. And when they come, we make them wish they hadn't." They found a position 20 yards off the trail, behind a tumble of boulders that gave them cover and a clear line of sight back the way the Germans were coming. Henley put Ritchie on the left flank with the Thompson, told him to hold fire until the patrol was within 50 yards. He put Daly and the private behind the center boulder, told them to stay low and keep quiet. Then he climbed onto a flat stone that gave him elevation, braced the Springfield against a crack in the rock, and waited. The German voices grew louder. 4 men, maybe 5, moving at a steady pace, not cautious, not hurried, just walking. Henley could hear their boots now, the creak of leather, the metallic clink of rifles and ammunition pouches. He slowed his breathing, felt his heartbeat settle into the rhythm he'd trained for. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. The pain in his shoulder faded into background noise. The ringing in his ear disappeared. There was only the rifle, the trail, and the men coming into view. They were Wehrmacht, not SS. Standard infantry, probably a recon element sweeping for stragglers. 5 men total. The one in front carried a Mauser rifle with a scope. The one in back had a machine pistol. The others were armed with carabiner 98Ks and moved like they'd done this 100 times before. Henley picked the one with the scope. Center mass. 400 yards. He adjusted for wind, for elevation, for the way his shoulder would pull the shot high and right. He thought about Kowalski, bleeding out in the dirt. He thought about his father, standing in the pulpit on Sunday mornings, talking about forgiveness and justice and the thin line between the two. He thought about the question he still couldn't answer. Then he squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the hillside, flat and sharp. The German with the scope went down hard, didn't move. The others scattered, shouting, diving for cover. Henley worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round, fired again, missed. The Germans were returning fire now, bullets snapping through the branches overhead, ricocheting off stone. Ritchie opened up with the Thompson, short controlled bursts, forcing them to keep their heads down. Daly was yelling something, but Henley couldn't hear it over the gunfire. He fired a third time, hit one of the Germans in the leg, watched him go down, screaming. The others were pulling back now, dragging their wounded, laying down, suppressing fire as they retreated. Henley fired twice more, forcing them farther back, then stopped. 7 rounds left. The Germans were gone, vanished into the trees, but they'd be back. With more men, with machine guns, with mortars if they had them. "Move," Henley shouted. "Bridge, now." They ran, Daly limping, the private stumbling, Ritchie covering the rear with the Thompson. Henley came last, keeping low, watching the tree line for movement. They hit the bridge at a dead sprint, boots pounding on stone, and for 10 seconds Henley was certain they'd all die right there, cut down by a burst of machine gun fire from the ridge. But the ridge stayed silent. No shots, no voices, just the wind and the sound of their own breathing. They made it across, climbed into the chestnut trees on the far side, collapsed behind cover, gasping for air. Henley's shoulder felt like it was on fire. His ribs screamed with every breath, but they were alive, all 4 of them. "Jesus," Ritchie said, staring back at the bridge. That was too close. Henley didn't answer. He was watching the far tree line, waiting for the Germans to reappear, waiting for the sound of engines or boots or the whistle of incoming mortar fire. But there was nothing, just silence, and the terrible knowledge that they weren't safe yet, not even close. Because the ridge ahead was still 2 miles away, and somewhere between here and there, the math was going to catch up with them again. It always did. They moved through the chestnut grove in single file, Ritchie on point with the Thompson, Daly limping behind him, the private after that, and Henley bringing up the rear with the Springfield. The trees were bare, skeletal, offering no real concealment, but at least breaking up their silhouettes against the grey sky. The ground was soft with rotting leaves, muffling their footsteps but making the going treacherous for Daly, who had to stop every 100 yards to catch his breath and let the pain in his legs subside. Nobody spoke. Sound carried in these hills, and they'd already made enough noise at the bridge to draw every German patrol within a mile. Henley kept his eyes on the trail behind them, listening for pursuit. His bad ear was useless, just that constant high whine, but his good ear caught everything. The wind through branches, a crow cawing somewhere to the east, the distant rumble of artillery that never quite stopped in this part of Italy. No voices yet, no boots, but that didn't mean they weren't coming. The Germans he'd shot at the bridge would have radioed back by now, called for reinforcements, marked the position. Standard procedure. Which meant they had maybe an hour before this hillside was crawling with enemy soldiers looking to settle a score. The ridge was visible now through the trees, a dark mass rising against the horizon maybe 1.5 miles ahead. Henley could see smoke rising from what he assumed were American positions, thin grey columns that looked like cook fires or burned-out vehicles. No way to know which until they got closer. No way to know if those positions were even still held by friendlies. The line shifted constantly out here, ground changing hands sometimes twice in a day. You could walk right into a German strongpoint thinking you were heading home, and by the time you realized your mistake, you were already dead. They reached a clearing, maybe 40 yards across, covered in low scrub and scattered rocks. Ritchie held up a fist, signaling halt. They all went flat, watching the far side for movement. Henley scanned the tree line through the cracked stock of the Springfield, finger resting outside the trigger guard, breathing slow despite the fire in his ribs. The clearing looked empty, felt wrong anyway, too exposed, too quiet. "We go around," Henley whispered. "That adds 20 minutes, Ritchie hissed back. "Better than crossing open ground in daylight." Daly groaned, shifting his weight off his bad leg. "I don't have 20 minutes. Henley looked at him. The sergeant's face was pale, slick with sweat despite the cold. The bandage on his thigh was soaked through, dark red, spreading down to his knee. He'd lost a lot of blood. Maybe too much. If they didn't get him to a medic soon, he'd go into shock, and after that, it wouldn't matter how careful they were. He'd be dead weight. "Can you make it across?" Henley asked. "I can make it anywhere you can, Corporal." Henley held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We cross. Fast and low. Richie first, then the kid, then Daly. I'll cover from here, then follow. Anything moves in those trees, I'll put it down, understand?" They all nodded. On 3, he counted. On 3, Richie broke cover and sprinted across the clearing, legs pumping, Thompson held at the ready. Made it to the far side, dropped behind a boulder, scanned the trees. Nothing. He waved the all clear. The private went next, moving awkward with his busted arm, but fast enough. Made it across. Then Daly. He started strong, but slowed halfway, favoring his bad leg, breathing hard. Henley watched the tree line, watched Daly, watched the seconds tick by like hours. Daly was 10 yards from cover when Henley saw movement in the trees to the north. A flicker of field grey, a helmet, then another. "Contact left," he shouted, swinging the Springfield around. The first German stepped into view, raising his rifle. Henley fired, worked the bolt, fired again. The German went down. A second one appeared, then a third. Daly was stumbling now, trying to run, and Richie was laying down covering fire with the Thompson, short bursts that tore through the underbrush and forced the Germans back. Henley fired twice more, hitting nothing, then saw Daly collapse 5 yards from cover. The private ran out, grabbed him under the arms, started dragging him back. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, snapped through the air. Henley fired his last 2 rounds, heard the metallic click of the bolt locking back on an empty magazine. He rolled off the rock, scrambled down, started running. Bullets chased him across the clearing, kicking up geysers of dirt and dead leaves. He could hear shouting now, German voices coordinating, and the heavy crack of a machine gun opening up from somewhere deeper in the trees. He dove the last 10 feet, hit the ground hard behind the boulder where Richie and the others were pinned down. Pain exploded through his shoulder and ribs, white-hot, blinding. He bit down on a scream, tasted blood. "How many?" Richie shouted over the gunfire. "At least 6, maybe more. We can't stay here. We can't move either. That MG has us pinned." Daly was on his back, eyes half closed, breathing shallow. The private was trying to stop the bleeding with his one good hand, pressing down on the wound with a piece of torn shirt. It wasn't working. Too much blood. Too fast. Henley reloaded the Springfield with his last magazine, 5 rounds, and risked a look around the boulder. The machine gun was set up maybe 150 yards out, partially concealed behind a fallen log. He could see the muzzle flash, hear the steady hammering rhythm. 2-man crew probably, one feeding the belt, one on the trigger. Infantry moving up on both flanks, using the covering fire to advance. Standard tactics. Good tactics. In another 5 minutes, they'd have the Americans surrounded and cut off from any hope of reaching the ridge. Henley thought about his father again, standing in that pulpit, talking about faith and sacrifice. He thought about all the times he'd taken the shot, done the job, told himself it was necessary, justified. He thought about the 3 men with him now, 2 of them wounded, all of them depending on him to get them out of this. And he thought about the question he'd been asking since the day he put on the uniform. What did God expect from a man who killed for a living? Maybe the answer was simpler than he'd been making it. Maybe it wasn't about the killing. Maybe it was about what you were willing to die for. "Give me the Thompson," he said. Richie stared at him. "What?" "The Thompson. Give it to me." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to take out that gun, buy you time to move." "That's suicide." "Probably." Henley met his eyes. "But Daly's got 5 minutes, maybe less. You try to drag him out of here with that MG still firing. You'll all be dead before you get 20 yards. This is the only way." "There's got to be another—" "There isn't." Henley's voice was flat, final. You know it. I know it. Now give me the gun and get ready to run." For a long moment, nobody moved. The machine gun kept hammering, bullets chewing through the rock and dirt around them. Then Richie handed over the Thompson, and Henley checked the magazine. Half full. Maybe 30 rounds. Enough. He looked at the private. "You get Daly out of here. You understand? Whatever it takes." The kid nodded, eyes wide. Henley turned to Richie. "You make it to the ridge. You tell them what happened here. You tell them there are more POWs out there, moving through these hills, trying to get home. You tell them to look." "I will." Henley nodded, took a breath, felt the weight of the Thompson in his hands, the pain in his shoulder and ribs, fading into something distant and unimportant. He thought about Knoxville, about Sunday mornings and lumber mills and all the things he'd left behind when he joined up. He thought about Kowalski and all the others who'd died in these hills, and he wondered if any of it had mattered, if any of it would be remembered. Then he stood up and started walking toward the machine gun. He didn't run. Running would have gotten him killed in the first 10 steps. Instead, he moved at a steady walk, firing the Thompson in short, controlled bursts, advancing like he was on a range back at Benning, like there was all the time in the world. The Germans saw him immediately, shifted fire, but he was already moving, weaving between boulders and scrub, closing the distance. Bullets snapped past his head, tugged at his jacket, kicked up dirt at his feet. He kept walking. 50 yards. He put a burst into the trees on the left flank, saw one of the advancing infantry go down. 40 yards. The machine gun swung toward him, tracers lighting up the air, and he dove behind a rock, let the burst pass over him, then came up firing. 30 yards. He could see the gun crew now, 2 men crouched behind the log, one of them frantically reloading. He fired again, hit the loader in the chest, watched him fall backward. The gunner grabbed for a rifle. Henley was already moving. 20 yards. The gunner got off one shot, missed high. Henley didn't. He emptied the last of the magazine into the log, into the gunner, into the space where the machine gun had been. Then the Thompson clicked empty, and he was standing in the open with nothing but a broken rifle and 5 rounds. The remaining Germans were closing in, 3 of them, rifles raised. Henley dropped the Thompson, unslung the Springfield, worked the bolt. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. He felt no fear, no anger, no regret. Just a strange, cold clarity, like everything had finally simplified down to this one moment. He fired. One of the Germans went down, worked the bolt, fired again, missed. The other 2 were firing now, and he felt the impact before he heard the shot, a punch to the side that spun him halfway around and dropped him to one knee. He fired again, hit the second German in the shoulder. The third was running toward him, bayonet fixed, screaming something in German. Henley worked the bolt, tried to fire, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. The rifle slipped from his grip. The German was 10 feet away. 5. Then the German's head exploded, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Henley turned, vision blurring, and saw Richie standing at the edge of the clearing, Daly's rifle in his hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Behind him, the private was dragging Daly toward the trees. Richie fired twice more, covering them, then ran to Henley and hauled him to his feet. "I told you to run," Henley said, tasting copper. "Yeah, well," Richie said, slinging Henley's good arm over his shoulder. "I don't take orders so good." They stumbled back toward the trees, Richie half carrying him, bullets still snapping through the air, but less now, sporadic. The Germans were pulling back, regrouping. It wouldn't last, but it didn't have to. They just needed 5 minutes, just needed to get over the ridge and into American lines. The climb was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Henley's side was on fire, blood soaking through his jacket, and his legs kept trying to fold under him. But Richie held him up, and the private was ahead with Daly, somehow still moving. And then they were at the top of the ridge, and Henley saw sandbags and foxholes, and the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. American helmets. Someone shouted. Boots came running. Hands grabbed him, lowered him to the ground. A medic appeared, started cutting away his jacket, asking questions Henley couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. He looked up at the sky, grey and endless, and thought about his father, about the question he'd finally stopped asking. Because the answer wasn't in the Bible or the bullets or the men he'd killed. It was in the men he'd saved, the men who'd refused to leave him behind, the debt that had finally been paid. He closed his eyes and let the darkness come. 3 days later, Corporal James Franklin Henley woke up in a field hospital 10 miles behind the lines. His shoulder was immobilized, his ribs were wrapped tight, and there was a fresh scar on his side where a German bullet had passed through without hitting anything vital. The doctors told him he'd been lucky. He told them luck had nothing to do with it. Sergeant Daly was in the bed next to him, pale but alive. The private was across the tent, arm in a cast, already complaining about the food. Richie came by that afternoon, told him they'd all been put in for commendations, told him the army was sending patrols out to look for more POWs in the hills, told him he'd done good. Henley didn't feel like he'd done good. He felt like he'd done what needed doing, same as always. But when Richie asked if he'd do it again, he found himself nodding, because that was the thing about debts. You kept paying them, one way or another, until the books balanced or you ran out of time. A week later, when they loaded him onto a transport heading back to Naples for surgery and eventual rotation home, Henley looked out at the hills one last time. Somewhere out there, other men were still moving through those same ridges and valleys, trying to find their way back. Some would make it, some wouldn't. That was war. That was the math. But as the truck pulled away and the Apennines faded into the distance, Henley thought about the bridge, about the clearing, about the moment he'd stood up and started walking toward the machine gun. And he thought maybe, just maybe, his father would have been proud. Maybe God had been watching after all. Maybe the books had finally balanced. He closed his eyes and let himself believe it, if only for a little while. Because sometimes, belief was the only thing that kept you moving forward. The only thing that made the 1,000 miles mean something more than just distance traveled. The only map that mattered when you were trying to find your way home.